I'm on the couch in the owner's office. They've just offered me the job. I've accepted, and it's this where you would think this would be a really happy moment, but what was going through my mind was there's nowhere else to go. I was sitting on our couch thinking like, so am I going to do this for 30 years? When I was thinking about what to name my business, I landed on Evolution Mental Health Services, and it was total projection on my part because I was like, I'm trying to evolve as a person, and this is part of that process.
Welcome to this edition of the Business Brains and BS podcast. Today, I think we may be leaning kind of heavily on the BS. Greg and I were talking the other day, and I was telling him about a quote that I saw. Jimmy Carr, the comedian, said, "Happiness is your current situation minus expectations." And we thought that that might be something kind of fun to unpack because, I think this goes to kind of that mindset of, where am I? Am I letting myself be a victim, or am I going to, power through this? So, Greg, I'm sure you probably see a lot of people who, maybe they have a life that we think, I don't know why you wouldn't be happy, right? You've got it all, but for some reason you just don't seem to be able to enjoy it. So when you have somebody who comes along like that, how do you unpack that with them?
Where my mind goes with that quote is the concept of acceptance, um, like how the reality of what things are right here and right now, and kind of be okay with that. Not to say that you could accept your current situation and be content, and still want something different, still want to add to that. Those two don't have to be in conflict with each other, but that idea of like, I'll give you an example. So from my own life, when I started this business, this was the first time of me owning a business. So my thought process going in was, worst case scenario, this doesn't pan out and I have to go back to doing what I did before. I didn't like the idea of that, but that's what I was telling myself to make it okay. Right. And then somewhere along the way, I realized that I could sustain myself individually pretty easily as a therapist. So the new worst case scenario became, worst case scenario, maybe I'm not cut out to run a larger business, but I can support myself. And that felt really good. Whereas the worst case scenario, go back to doing what I was doing, felt kind of like a bummer. The worst case scenario, I just kind of start from scratch with just me. While it's not what I want, but it felt better than the first worst case scenario. Um, but then there's still goals that I have. Like I said, I don't want my current business to go under. I don't want to decrease in size. I want to grow. I want to be able to do new things, cool things. But that knowledge of like, but I'm okay where I'm at. My life is not bad. I have a pretty good life as it is. So everything from here is just kind of icing on the cake, so to speak. And even if I took a little setback or two, as long as, certain things are okay, I'm okay. Um, something I tell myself sometimes when I get overwhelmed or anxious, or, things are going on that are affecting my state of mind. Sometimes I'll kind of go outside or something, get some fresh air, to take a couple breaths, and I'll tell myself, none of this really matters. Like when I think about what really matters in my life, it's a pretty short list. And if those things are okay, I'll be okay. And everything else is to add to that. So that's kind of where my mind goes. First, take on that quote. I don't know Jimmy Carr. He's a funny guy, but that's where my mind went.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think that you bring up an interesting point because it makes me think of, my life before being a business owner. I was a sales manager with a Fortune 100 company, had big house, pool, just most people would look at me and say, he's got great marriage, great wife, great kids. managed to not go to jail for anything stupid, myself or my kids. So, everybody would probably look at it and say, wow, he's got to be just the happiest guy in the world. But I wasn't. And yeah, as I think about expectations, it makes me think about other people, right? And then kind of the keeping up with the Joneses, and how many of us, our expectations aren't focused on what you were just talking about, as far as, what are the most important things in my life. And I'm the only one who could decide that, right? That shouldn't be something that somebody else is dictating to me. But I think with social media, with friend groups, whatever, with television advertising, I mean, let's face it, the world of advertising has done a really, really good job of making us feel like crap, right? It's like, I don't have the newest Lexus. My wife doesn't carry a $5,000 handbag, right? So I must be a terrible provider, an awful husband, right? So I think when we look at that quote and we say, happiness is your current situation minus expectations, I think it really comes to those expectations, right? And how much of the external world am I allowing to put pressure on those expectations? Because when I left corporate America and looked at it and said, I'm tired of people having to answer to people, right? I'm tired of um, looking at it and going, well, that doesn't make any sense. That wasn't explained. Why are we doing it this way? I'm tired of the flavor of the month, right? That everybody, this is what we're going to do. And then a month later, we're doing something else. So at that point, it's like, okay, I'm going to go out here and I'm going to do this all on my own. There was a lot of security and a lot of safety in that old, that old place, right? I mean, I knew I was getting a paycheck every 2 weeks. I had I don't think I ever used all of my vacation, right? I rolled a bunch of it over, 5 weeks of vacation. I had paid company holidays, that type of stuff. Was a business owner, you don't get that stuff, right? And when you do have it, you got in the back of your mind, okay, what's going on? What else? What did I not get done? Is everything going okay at the business with me not being there? Um, but I'm realizing more and more and more now that I'm happier now than I ever was, with the big paycheck and the big house and the swimming pool and all that. And I think it's because, I've drawn closer to my family. I've drawn closer, in my spirituality. And I think my expectations have changed. As a manager, I think there was always, I was told, and this was not great advice, buy the most expensive house you can afford. Right. And I was told that by one of my managers, which makes sense. Right. Because then if I have a big debt, it's like, okay, get your ass out of bed, go out there and work, because you got a big mortgage you got to pay off. Right. But getting away from that and being able to focus on me and focus on growing myself. Right. And changing those expectations. And, I realized that the big house, the nice car, all of that stuff, that really doesn't matter. So, from a material standpoint, where I was so much, bigger at that time, but from an inside me point, it was so much smaller, if that makes any sense.
100% to what you're saying. We downsized significantly to start this business. Um, I mean, significantly. And it's only been within the last couple of years that we've kind of caught up to where we were. Forget getting ahead of that, just kind of caught up to the same standard of living we had when we started. Um, but you're right. Like I felt the same way, like so much happier doing this. Whenever, when I decided that I wanted to start my own business, I thought I was nervous to tell my wife this idea because I thought she was going to shoot it down. Um, Nothing against her. I just, because of everything we're talking about, the lack of security, and all that. Um, and so I told her, hey, I'm thinking about starting my own business. What do you think about that? And she immediately was like, I think you should do it. And I was like, okay, well, like, let's talk about the implications, the finances and all that. And she was like, so we did. And she still was like, no, I think you should do it. And I, I told her, I was like, I wasn't expecting you to be this gung ho about it. And she was like, I want you to be happy. And you're not happy with what you're doing. And it's worth it to me. If you can be happy with what you're doing, it's worth taking a hit financially. Um, and that's when I think about kind of what I was saying, starting out, like the worst case scenario, even worst case scenario, starting back kind of from scratch, feels so much better. Because for me, a big thing that really drives me is freedom. There's a couple things. Freedom is a big part of it. And just being able to pursue what interests me, like you said, without somebody telling me this is the new thing we're doing, make it happen. You know, that's huge. And working for yourself, you have that freedom. So the idea of going back to having office hours and all these, kind of what I find to be kind of silly rules sometimes, and all these expectations that I may or may not care about, and getting rid of all that and having the freedom to pursue what really drives me is huge. And the other big thing for me is creativity. I've always been a creative person. You know this, in my past life, that's how I refer to it. Before I was got into the mental health world, I was a musician. I've always had creative outlets that I pursued, and building a business is a creative endeavor. And so the freedom and the creativity piece are huge to me, and that is worth way more than a few extra $1,000, on my tax return or whatever. So I completely relate with what you're saying there. If you can indulge me for a few minutes, your statement about the keeping up with the Joneses and advertising, um, you triggered this is something I talk about a lot with people. Okay. So that what you're talking about, that like this idea that like, oh, my life sucks, I have to get this thing, that is all by design. Um, we are hardwired like to basically do two things: avoid threats and pursue rewards. You know, that's just basic psychology. It's like it's tied to the concepts of like negative and positive reinforcement. Like, I don't want this bad thing to happen, I want the good thing to happen. And at our core, we're kind of always doing that. Avoid the threat, pursue the reward. But push comes to shove, if we have to pick one over the other, people almost always choose avoid threat. It's survival. We choose survival. Um, and people don't realize how this ties into the things that you're talking about, because we think like threats and survival. We think about things like a mugger in an alley or a bear chasing us through the woods or something like that. And yes, those are very real threats that have to be overcome or dealt with. But there's so many subtle things that we can perceive as threats. And notice I said perceive. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And but it triggers that same part of our brain, that same survival instinct. That's a more primitive part of our brain. That's more, you might call it animalistic. That kind of survival instinct. And so, for instance, I think I might have even used this example in a different podcast episode, but let's say you and me are coworkers and we're hanging out in the office one day, and I think you're looking at me funny. You know, that doesn't sound like a serious threat, right? Um, but it still triggers that same part of my brain. You and I are speaking as people who live in, 2025. We're in like suburban Tulsa, in a very safe neighborhood. All our basic needs are met. You know, let's say that you and I were part of a nomadic tribe of hunter gatherers or whatever, 5,000 years ago. We would definitely need each other to survive, literally to survive. You know, we would have to work together as a group to just meet our basic needs. And if I upset people in the group, like if you all decided that I suck at my job in the group, or if you all decided that I'm just too annoying to be around or whatever, and you kick me out of the group and I'm on my own, that very well may cost me my life. And that doesn't happen today necessarily in our context, but it's still, we have this part of our brain that interprets things like social isolation and ostracization as threat. So in the current context, my coworker Eric's looking at me funny. It triggers this more animalistic part of my brain that's like, there's danger here, you know? And you might not even be looking at me funny. You might see something on the wall behind me and trying to figure out what it is. Or you just might be zoned out in your own world. But I can interpret it that way. And so that puts me in this kind of fight or flight state of mind whether I should be or not, it puts me there, you know, and then I feel like I need to react. I need to do something about this threat. So maybe it's I avoid Eric, take the flight route, or maybe it's I'm like, hey, what's your problem? What are you staring at? Take the more, the fight route. Um, but it triggers that impulse. And so tying it back to like advertising and material possessions and things like that, we get to this point. I said we like to avoid threats and chase rewards. A weird thing that happens with this is something that starts as a reward can turn into a threat in that if we don't achieve it. So like, I'll give you an example. I have a client that I work with who owns his own small business. And he had made himself like a vision board, and he was telling me, and about it. And one of the things on his vision board is he has this like green Lamborghini, like that's the car he wants, and, and so he's telling me about it, and we're talking, and he was saying like, but the thing that gets him is like, he feels like if he can't get the green Lambo, something's wrong with him. So what started out as a reward to chase now is a threat. It's like, if I don't get it, something's wrong with me, you know? So that's the threat part. And dude, advertisers, like they understand this better than most people. Um, and so if they can introduce a threat, that this advertising does this all the time. Politicians do this all the time and political ads. Introduce the threat and then introduce the solution for how you're going to deal with the threat. And so, aren't you sick of your old, broken down car? Check this one out, or, like home security systems, like, they show burglars breaking into your house, and it's always like, if you think about the types of houses in those commercials, they look like a house that a lot of people could live in. It's not a rundown house in a bad neighborhood. It's not a mansion. It's, they're shooting for the middle, you know, and it's like, it's not a rundown house in a bad neighborhood. It's not a mansion. It's, they're shooting for the middle, you know, and it's like,
Yeah, and the man is never there. It's always the mom and some kids, right? So as a man, it's like, I'm not there, I'm on a trip or whatever, I've gotta do something to protect my family. You're right, not to be sexist, but I think that just kinda speaks to that, part of who we are.
yeah. So they introduce the threat and then introduce the solution for the threat. And then that triggers that part of our brain that's like, oh, I got to have this. Whether that's a home security system or a green Lamborghini, it's like, I need this or something bad is going to happen.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because 'cause you're making me think back to junior high school, right? So, back in the '80s, polo, Ralph Lauren was a big deal, and everybody walked around with the little polo player on their shirt, they were styling and profiling with their Levi's 501 jeans, and I didn't have any polo shirts, right? But I don't remember if it was Kmart or which company it was, came out with Knights of the Round Table, and it was a knight, right, with a lance, and then he had a little flag on there, so it was almost a polo, but, it wasn't made quite as well, I don't think, right? But it was like, "Okay, I'm gonna get this so I can, from a distance, at least look like I belong and I fit in," and I just think about, that mindset there, and going back to what you're talking about as far as the tribe of nomads and fitting in and social isolation, and, it's amazing. You think about it as a young person that, what a what a great time in our lives, right? I mean, you have no real responsibility other than show up and go to school, do your homework, and then come home and change out of your school clothes into your play clothes. I mean, I grew up at a time where, you know, mom would feed us breakfast in the summer and say, "Okay, I'll see you for dinner," right? And throw us out, and we'd go out and have a great time, and that was fun. But then you start bringing in this, I need to fit in component to it. And again, I think it goes back to the, what are the expectations? Well, I don't have the shirt, so I'm not cool. I don't know the head cheerleader, so I'm not cool. So my happiness drops because my expectations are being tied to how I perceive other people are living their life.
It ties back into, like you said, the social component. What do other people think? Even if I feel okay with it, like you were talking about, like the house with the pool, and okay, if I'm not going to live in the house with the pool, What are all my neighbors who have the same type of house and the pool? They're going to think, well, what's wrong with Eric? What happened to him? You know, that he's no longer part of.
Yeah, he failed. Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point. You look at our society, our culture, and really most people would, I mean, if you ask them to define success, one of the first things, if not the first thing out of their mouth, would probably be financial, right? And so, and how do you show everybody else you have financial success? You have the green Lamborghini, you have the big house, you have the pool, you have, the the trophy wife with the diamond ring and the diamond tennis bracelets and all of these things, right? Because it's I've got to show this. But again, it goes back to, is that really happiness, or is that us just putting on this show for for society and not really worried about what matters the most to us?
Yeah.
And I think about it from a business perspective too, right? It's I meet so many business owners who they'll talk about the revenue all day long. I've got $5 million company, that's great. But when I start digging down, they're losing money, right? They don't have any profit. And we've got a saying at Action Coach, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, and cash is king, right? And so often I think business owners get swept up in that same mentality of, right, I have to put out this persona, or this air that I'm successful and my business is thriving, when inside, that's kind of like the duck on the pond thing, right? They're trying to look calm and cool on the surface, and they're paddling like hell under the water.
It always reminds me of a line from Fight Club. They say, the stuff you own ends up owning you. And I think whether that's a house, a car, it could be your business. You know, you become a slave to maintaining these certain things.
Well, and something else that you said that I want to go back to, because I think this is really important too when it comes to happiness. Happiness is your current situation minus expectations, right? You talked about your wife being supportive of you, and I had the same experience. And it's really funny because I've been through training, I've talked to people, and they talk about all the people who um, discourage them, right? "Oh, you can't, what are you're Greg, you're crazy. What the hell are you thinking? You're never going to be successful in a business," right? And I feel very blessed that I haven't really had any of those people in my life. I mean, everybody in my family has been supportive of this thing, more supportive of me than I have at times, right? Which I think went back to, okay, I haven't grown this thing to where it needs to be. My expectations were higher, therefore I was unhappy, right? But I think, the people you surround yourself with is a huge part of your happiness too, right? Because thinking about the message that they're sending to you, and if they're not achieving in their life, then they're going to try to bring you down, right? So their expectations are everybody should be as miserable as I am. So I just think it's really kind of an interesting take there too, to say, who are you surrounding yourself with? What's fueling you? Are the people you're talking to giving you positives? Are they giving you negatives? And I think the really cool thing about the world in which we live right now is you can choose to hang out with whoever you want, right? If you wanted to hang out with Jim Rohn, or, Simon Sinek, or, Marshall Goldstein, or whoever it is, right? These guys have all got books and podcasts and all these things. So you can have a peer group, an influence group, a group of mentors who you've never met, who have been successful, that you can pull off of, right? So it's kind of that whole, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And again, I think it goes back to expectations, right? If I'm learning from those people, if I'm taking from them and implementing those things into my life, and thinking about how am I going to do this? How am I going to move forward? How am I going to grow? And I think that's a big part of happiness too, is I think back to when I was so miserable, I had achieved everything that I wanted to achieve. I had set a goal of being a sales manager and achieved it. Had been a successful sales manager for several years. But then I was like, what's next? And I stopped working on me. I stopped growing. And I think that's where, deep down in the back of my brain, it's like the expectation is you're meant to be more. You're meant to continue to grow, right? We are the only life force on the planet, human beings, that have the option to decide to stop growing.
Or define how we want to grow. Like, I totally resonate with what you said about like the what's next. The first like upper management position I got in, I was at this company. I got promoted to clinical director, and at that company, that was the highest position I could have. And I remember at the time when I got that promotion, I was, I think, 35, and I'm on the couch in the owner's office. They've just offered me the job. I've accepted. And it's this where you would think this would be a really happy moment, but what was going through my mind was there's nowhere else to go. And I was sitting on our couch thinking like, so am I going to do this for 30 years, this job? And I didn't like that feeling. So when I left that company a few years later, I went to a much larger company, and that was part of the motivation was like, there's way more room to grow here. I started at a position that responsibility wise was pretty similar to where I came from, but there's opportunity for more because of the size of the company. But then figured out that, we've talked about this in a previous episode, like that wasn't what I wanted. The types of opportunities weren't the types of opportunities that I wanted. And working for myself, like owning my own business, I can define those. And so that was when I was thinking about what to name my business. I landed on Evolution Mental Health Services. And it was total projection on my part because I was like, I'm trying to evolve as a person, and this is part of that process. And then, of course, like that's a big part of what we do in the business is help other people evolve. But people assume that a lot of times that I named the business Evolution because we're helping other people evolve. But truth was that was a time in my life where I want to evolve the way, like into the person I want to be, to the life I want to have, and that's where the name came from. So it's not only having the choice of, do I want to keep growing? But like, how do I want to grow? In what direction do I want to grow? That's huge.
And I think that's a big part of why we're put here, right? Is to grow and to evolve and to become better. And yeah, it's just made such a difference in my life, getting back to working on me, to learning about me, to learning about how to be a better business owner, to learning about how to recognize the thoughts that are holding me back, and learning how to put that filter up and hear them, and then say, wait a minute, is that really what I believe about myself? And when I started working on me again, that's really when I started to be happier again. So that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. And the downsizing that we talked about, it made me think about, this is just on the fly, it made me think about like a plant, like pruning a plant. Sometimes you got to cut a little back to get more growth. And so maybe that's just part of the process sometimes, is you trim off the stuff that's not what you want so you can get more of what you do want.
No, I think that's awesome. That's a great takeaway. Yeah. Sometimes you got to cut it back a little bit, the pruning, in order to grow. So, all right, fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the Business Brains and BS, heavy on the BS this week podcast. If you're still here, that means you probably enjoyed it. So if you are listening to us or watching us on YouTube, gonna go ahead and ask you to press that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify, go ahead and follow, and then let's make sure that you guys leave us a review if you would. Do us a big favor, give us a 5-star review, leave some comments there so that we can get this podcast out to as many people as possible. So until next time, we'll see you.